During the 1940s, both in Europe and in North America, coal shortages, blackout regulations and rationing created a heating emergency that, honestly, most civilians today have never even heard about. When the military absorbed massive quantities of fuel for factories and transport, countless families faced brutal winters with radiators that barely warmed or sometimes didn't run at all. Power failures were common. Coal deliveries were inconsistent. And, the winters of the early 1940s were some of the coldest on record in several regions. People started turning to whatever tricks they could find to keep homes above freezing. This is where a quietly ingenious loophole emerged, one that allowed entire households to stay warm without electricity, without coal, and without burning a single log. It wasn't a gadget or a black market tool. It was a method that exploited the physics of thermal mass and residual heat inside cast-iron radiators. It spread quietly through towns, tenements, farmhouses and boarding rooms. And, it worked so well that people kept using it long after the war. Today, it's really one of the most underrated and misunderstood pieces of heating knowledge from the early 20th century. Now let's break down exactly what this radiator loophole was, why it worked, and how you can still apply it today when the grid goes down or fuel becomes scarce. The loophole worked because, cast-iron radiators store far more heat than most people realize. The heart of the trick is something old engineers understood deeply. Cast iron isn't just metal. It's thermal mass with memory. When heated with steam or hot water, cast-iron radiators absorb and retain enormous amounts of energy. What most people didn't know in the 1940s is that those radiators continue releasing heat slowly for many hours after the boiler stops running. Even a small radiator can weigh over 70 pounds of iron. Large ones can weigh 200 or more. All that mass acts like a slow-release battery, In wartime cities where boilers fired only once or twice per day because of fuel rationing, people began noticing that their radiators stayed warm long after the heat cycles ended. This led to a trick that spread by word of mouth. Saturate the radiators with as much heat as possible at whatever moment fuel or steam was available, then insulate the room and let that stored heat radiate through the night. Some families would even coordinate with neighbours when district steam briefly activated, running into their apartments to swing valves fully open and, charge the cast iron. Once the supply shut down, the radiators still radiated for hours. This behaviour wasn't magic. It was pure physics, and people soon learned to amplify it dramatically. During the early 1940s, many households began modifying their homes to extend the life of their radiator heat. So they draped thick wool blankets over the windows, stuffed towels under the door gaps, and, hung heavy curtains, not really for privacy, but to trap as much thermal mass as possible. Some folks even went so far as to build simple wooden radiator covers lined with metal sheeting, just to redirect the heat toward the centre of the room, instead of letting it rise uselessly into the walls. This, in turn, created what many called radiator rooms, a sort of temporary storm shelter for winter, if you like. Families would gather in a single room with the highest radiator mass and make it the warm zone, allowing the radiator's stored energy to heat the space for long stretches, even when the boiler wasn't running at all. With careful insulation, people managed to keep rooms above 50 degrees Fahrenheit, even during blackouts that lasted 11 or 12 hours. A particularly effective tactic, involved compressing all household activity into just one insulated zone. This was the real loophole, using design, not fuel, to, multiply the heat output. Another little-known trick from the era involved partially closing the radiator valve after heating so that a small volume of hot water remained trapped inside. Normally, radiators drained fully as steam systems cycled. But homeowners discovered that if they closed the valve immediately after the last heating cycle, the radiator retained a pool of hot water that acted like a miniature thermal reservoir. That internal water stayed warm far longer than the metal alone, and continued radiating heat into the room for several additional hours. This wasn't, an official recommendation. Plumbers frowned on it, but people used it because it worked. The water inside extended the radiator's thermal mass, effectively combining two heat storage systems, iron and liquid. Today, modern hydronic systems do this intentionally with buffer tanks. But wartime civilians achieved a similar effect with just a twist of a valve. If you want to apply this knowledge practically, the steps are simple. First, identify the heaviest radiator or thermal mass heater in your home. Heat it thoroughly during the period when power or fuel is available. Second, isolate the room, seal drafts, close unnecessary doors, and hang blankets to reduce heat loss. Third, extend the thermal retention by reducing airflow around the radiator. A simple sheet of metal placed behind it reflects heat outward rather than letting it soak into the wall. This method is invaluable during power outages or storms. That is exactly what wartime families discovered, and honestly, the physics hasn't changed. This 1940s loophole survives because, it still solves a real survival problem. Fuel scarcity, grid instability, and those long cold spells are not relics of the past. They remain real issues in many regions today. The ingenuity of 1940s households, really demonstrates how much can be achieved by understanding materials, heat, and human behavior, rather than just relying on constant fuel consumption. If you value forgotten engineering and wartime survival knowledge, make sure to subscribe to In the Beginning, share this guide with fellow history enthusiasts, and help keep this channel growing so we can continue bringing these lost techniques back into the light.